Segregation been here from time to time, but we just ain't gonna pay it no mind. It's moving on. It's moving on.
I am Ben West, and this is my city. For the past 10 years, I have been its mayor. I have watched it grow from an overgrown country town into a great metropolitan complex.
Nashville was proud of its progressive tradition. A center for education, the arts, and industry, it had long promoted itself as the Athens of the South. But Nashville, like most southern cities, was segregated. Attracted by the city's 4 black colleges, many young people arrived from other parts of the country and encountered their first experience with segregation.
I was looking forward in college to really expanding myself and growing. I was taking those kinds of issues very seriously. And that played quite a part when I got to Nashville in why I so keenly resented segregation and not being allowed to do basic kinds of things like eating at restaurants in the 10-cent stores.
Looking for a way to fight segregation, Diane Nash and other students were drawn to activist Jim Lawson and his workshops in nonviolent direct action.
And that is to try to have one major role-playing experience which sort of tries to set the stage for an actual demonstration, for an actual sit-in.
When Jim Lawson came to the city, he began to organize students, right? And most important to that for both students and we who were ministers was that we had workshops. And the workshops in nonviolence made the difference. We began to understand the philosophy behind it, the tactics, the techniques, how to in fact begin to take the blows and still respond with some sense of dignity.
Nashville students would be motivated by an event that took place in Greensboro, North Carolina. On February 1st, 1960, 4 black college students sat down at a lunch counter reserved for whites and refused to leave. It was a direct challenge to Southern law and tradition.
Well, it's just not things we're used to down here. I mean, they come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us, because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now.
As the sit-in spread across the country, John Lewis, Angela Butler, and Diane Nash led students to Nashville's first sit-in.
The students were dressed like they were on the way to church. We went into the local stores. These stores were known all across the South, and for the most part, all across the country. We took our seats in a very orderly, peaceful fashion. We stayed there at the lunch counter studying and preparing our homework because we were denied service. The manager ordered that the lunch counters be closed, that the restaurants be closed. We just sit there, and we continue to sit all day long.
The sit-ins continued without incident for almost 2 weeks. Then, on February 27th, a warning. Gangs of toughs were gathering downtown. The students sat in as planned. The police did nothing to protect them. The students remained true to their strategy of nonviolence. When the police vans arrived, more than 80 demonstrators were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct.
The day that the police first arrested us, they announced to us, "Okay, all you niggers, get up from the lunch counter and, or we're going to arrest you." And their attitude was like, well, we warned you. So they repeated it a couple of times and nobody moved. And of course we were prepared for this. So they said, well, we warned you, you won't move, okay, everybody's under arrest. And then they turned and they looked around at the lunch counter again, and the second wave of students had all taken seats. And they were confounded. They kind of looked at each other like, now what do we do, you know? And they said, well, okay, we'll arrest those two. And they did it. And then the third wave. And no matter what they did and how many they arrested, there was still a lunch counter full of students there.
Peace, quiet, and good order will be maintained in our city to the best of our ability. Riots, melees, and disturbances of the peace are against the interest of all our people, and therefore cannot be permitted.
The local black community began to unite behind the students. Black merchants supplied food to those in jail. Homeowners put up property for bail money. The court found the students guilty of disorderly conduct. John Lewis refused to pay the $50 fine. He chose 33 days in the city workhouse instead. Most of the other students joined him in jail. To fight the jailing of their children, parents turned to the power of their own pocketbooks. In Nashville, in 1960, black buying power was estimated at $50 million a year, with $10 million spent in the downtown stores alone. Within a month, the boycott by black customers was almost completely effective. April 19th, dynamite thrown from a passing car at 5:30 in the morning destroyed the home of Z. Alexander Luby, one of Nashville's black city councilmen and defense attorney for the arrested students. The blast was so powerful it shattered 147 windows in Meharry Medical College across the street. Miraculously, no one was killed.
It was such an outrageous act that it could be very useful to a nonviolent movement then to move. Okay? It was a uniting of the city, but the outcome would be decided by how we, in fact, channel that energy, right? And we then had the first major march of the movement. People began to gather, and we began to march, and students came out from the lunchrooms, and they came out from being on the campus grounds, and they joined, and they came out of buildings and dormitories. We filled Jefferson Avenue. It's a long, long way down Jefferson. After a while, there was a certain bit of singing, and as we came closer to town, it was merely the silence of the feet.
Face to face on the steps of City Hall, Reverend C.T. Vivian condemned the mayor for his failure to speak out in the past. Diane Nash pushed Ben West to take a personal stand.
We needed him to say integrate the counters, or to tell Nashville to do what Nashville knows it should have done a long time ago, like about 95 years ago after the Civil War. So I asked the mayor, first of all, Mayor West, do you feel that it's wrong to discriminate against a person solely on the basis of his race or color?
And I tried as best I could to answer it, frankly and honestly, that I could not agree that it was morally right for someone to sell them merchandise and refuse them service. And I had to answer it just exactly that way. Of course, I received considerable criticism for it, but had I to answer it again, I would answer it in the same way again, because it was a moral question and was one that a man has to answer and not a politician.
3 weeks after Ben West's statement on the steps of City Hall, black customers were served for the first time at lunch counters in downtown stores. On April 15th, 1960, more than 200 veterans of the sit-in movement from Nashville and from other cities around the country gathered in Raleigh, North Carolina. Some suggested they join the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Dr. Martin Luther King. But SCLC's executive director, Ella Baker, advised the students to remain independent.
Ella Baker was very important, giving direction to the student movement in terms of really seeing how important it was to recognize the fact that the students should set the goals and directions and maintain control.
They formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and began organizing black communities throughout the South. The speech that captured the nation's attention was the stirring oratory of Martin Luther King.
Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring in Whitney Capital. When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
In the White House, President Kennedy now saw the march as positive support for his civil rights bill.
Of the National Committee for the March on Washington.
18 days later, Birmingham, Alabama. Just before a Sunday morning service, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church where hundreds of children had once gathered to march against police dogs and fire hoses. 15 people were injured. 4 children were killed. The murder of these children shook the nonviolent movement to its core. As the people buried their dead, they sang, "We shall overcome." But in anger and in rage, many wondered how.
We felt like our own children had been killed, and we knew that the activity of the civil rights movement had been involved in generating the kind of energy that brought out this kind of hostility. And we decided that we would do something about it, and we said that we had 2 options. The first one was we felt confident that if we tried, we could find out who had done it, and we could make sure they got killed. And we considered that as a real option. And the second option was that we felt that if blacks in Alabama had the right to vote, that they could protect black children. And we deliberately made a choice and chose the second option.
To tell me that they're citizens of this no good country, because integration will never happen. You'll never, as long as you live, integrate into the white man's system.
In the early 1960s, on inner city street corners in the North, many groups competed for the hearts and minds of Black America. The Nation of Islam and its spokesperson Malcolm X expressed the impatience that many Black Americans were feeling.
The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that it is time for you and me to stand up for ourselves. It is time for you and me to see for ourselves. It is time for you and me to hear for ourselves. And it is time for you and me to fight for ourselves. We don't need anybody today speaking for us, seeing for us, or fighting for us. We'll fight our own battles with the help of our God.
Malcolm X represented a different brand of leadership. Many of us that grew up in the South had been deeply influenced by the church, by the preaching of Black ministers, but also by the message, the philosophy, the teaching of Martin Luther King Jr., the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. We saw Malcolm as someone, in a sense, from the outside, coming from the North, to tell us that was a different way, a different approach.
Mine eyes have seen injustice.
Voices from the North began to influence the Southern movement. It had become clear just how high the stakes were. This was a struggle for life and death. To win that struggle, the movement would have to win in Mississippi.
There is no state with a record that approaches that of Mississippi in inhumanity, murder, brutality, and racial hatred.
The Mississippi struggle had been led by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. For 10 years, NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers had traveled the state fighting for racial justice.
Don't shop for anything on Capitol Street. Let's let the merchants...
In 1963, Evers organized an effective boycott of stores in downtown Jackson.
I had one merchant to call me, and he said, I want you to know that I've talked to my national office today, and they want me to tell you that we don't need nigger business.
Ignoring threats from segregationists, Medgar Evers rallied hundreds of students to march on the streets of Jackson.
You knew that something was going to happen, and the logical person for it to happen to was Medgar. And I used to try to reassure him and tell him, nothing's going to happen to you. The FBI is here. Laugh. Everybody knows you. You're in the press. They wouldn't dare do anything to you.
In June 1963, Medgar Evers was killed, shot in the back by a single round from a high-powered rifle.
And if you don't like this thing, let's get ready to change it.
Civil rights groups stepped up their campaign against the most formidable resistance ever. The issue was the right to vote. In some counties, blacks outnumbered whites 4-1. In many of those counties, no blacks were allowed to vote.
I don't want the Negro, as I have known him and contacted him during my lifetime, as a class to control the making of the law that controls me, to control the government under which I live.
The movement began recruiting local residents to help the voter drive.
I was asked would I join the SNCC, which was Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I said yes. And they said, well, what do I have to do? They said, just try to encourage people to go and try to register, go over to the courthouse. And that was my start of going around here to my neighbors and friends and asking them, you know, would they come and go to the courthouse and try to register to vote. People were being put off the plantations. People were threatened. Folks was put in jail just because we wanted people to try to register to vote.
Local black organizers had also been murdered. There were few trials, no convictions. Little national attention was paid. But activists pushed on as the state passed new voting laws to make registration more difficult.
Registering to vote at that time meant that you filled out a 22-question questionnaire. One of the questions was, interpret any of the 286 sections of the Mississippi Constitution to the satisfaction of the registrar. Now, you have to bear in mind that some of those registrars couldn't read or write, but that didn't matter. They could still determine who should be registered if that person happened to be black, because all whites who attempted to register were registered.
In June 1964, SNCC announced Freedom Summer, a statewide voter registration effort.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 teachers, ministers, lawyers, and students from all around the country who will engage in a program designed to open up Mississippi to the country.
Most of the students that and people we were bringing in for the summer project were from the large universities, and they were from families who were politicians, bankers, lawyers, and others. And we felt by the fact that bringing in those particular people, that the attention of their parents and relatives from the various different other parts of the country would be on these areas. And by having large numbers of whites in here, as the press, the American public would have much more concern than if there were just a bunch of blacks that were in the state.
When the civil rights workers invaded the state in the summer of 1964 to change us, presumably into their own image, they were met with a feeling of some curiosity, but mostly resentment. They fanned out across the state, made a great to-do of breaking up our customs, of flaunting social practices that had been respected by people here over the years.
Among the first wave of recruits to arrive in Mississippi was 20-year-old Andrew Goodman of New York City. He traveled with James Chaney, age 21, and Michael Schwerner, age 24, two workers from the Congress of Racial Equality. Sunday, June 21st. On Andy Goodman's first day in Mississippi, the three men drove to investigate the burning of a black Methodist church. The church had been the scene of a civil rights meeting just weeks before. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, their blue Ford station wagon was stopped by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price outside the town of Philadelphia. The three young men were released by Deputy Price around 10:30 that night. It was then that they disappeared. Within days, the disappearance was national news. President Lyndon Johnson ordered a massive search. 200 sailors from the Naval Air Station in Meridian moved into the Philadelphia area and were joined there by FBI agents.
Whenever an incident like this happens, and they happen fairly often, although not usually this serious, everyone reacts the same way. They become more and more determined to stay in a state and fight the evil system that people have to live under here. I'm down here because I believe that my freedom is very much entangled with the freedom of every other man, and that if another man's not free, then I'm not free. So I'm fighting for my own freedom here.
By early July, the volunteers had arrived in full force. Working with local residents, They established freedom schools, health clinics, community centers, and they registered voters across the state. Their presence made many Mississippians fearful.
And they would say yes to everything we said. We'd say, would you like to be involved in the voter registration project? Will you go down to vote? Yes, sir. And we knew we were not getting across. We knew they were just waiting for us to go away because we were a danger to them. And in many ways, we were.
During the summer, 80 civil rights workers were beaten. There were 1,000 arrests. Despite the danger, political organizing continued. By night, the schools were used for voter education. By day, children learned everything from the 3 R's to Black history and literature. By late July, the 3 young men had been missing for 6 weeks. Many lost hope that they were still alive. While the search continued, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The new law increased the federal government's power to ban discrimination in public places, but did little to enforce the voting rights of blacks. On August 4th, on a farm outside the town of Philadelphia, the bodies of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were discovered buried together in an earthen dam. The autopsy reports indicated that the men had been killed by .38 caliber bullets. A later report revealed that James Cheney, the one black victim, had also suffered severe bone and skull fractures. August 7th, 1964. Hundreds gathered in Meridian, Mississippi to mourn James Cheney. Among the mourners was Cheney's 8-year-old brother, Ben.
I feel that he's gotten his freedom, and we're still fighting for it. But what I want to talk about right now is the living dead that we have right among our midst, not only in the state of Mississippi, but throughout the nation. Those are the people who don't care, those who do care but don't have the guts enough to stand up for it, and those people who busy up in Washington and other places using my freedom and my life to play politics with. That includes the president on down to the governor of the state of Mississippi, you see.
I have been approached by the people of my national office of CORE and others to make sure that the speech that's given is calm. They don't want a lot of, things stirred up and everything else like that. And I'd agreed to do that. And I said, okay, fine, it's good. But then when I got up there and I looked out there and I